member of the faculty here at the Kennedy School. As an economist, I nearly always use a PowerPoint. It's sort of like, without a PowerPoint, an economist is like using sign language to speak. It's like a part of our integral language. So, but I'm not using a PowerPoint because I'm going to say completely crazy things, and really don't want a paper trail today. This conference 5 years ago when it was started was called a Blue Sky Conference. And it's like, what does blue sky mean? Well, blue sky means kind of out-of-the-box ideas. And like, I'm going to go way out of the box. So you might ask yourself, gee, that was a very sensible presentation by Homi Karas. He's a very sensible guy. Who could possibly disagree with Homi Karas? Who could possibly disagree with eradicating poverty as a goal for the global system? Me. I strongly disagree with the MDGs. I think the MDGs were a disaster. They were erosion. And I think eradicating poverty as a goal is a dangerous idea. And as you'll notice the title of today's presentation, it's The Dangerous Seduction of Kinky Development. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by kinky development is perhaps not what you hope I mean, which would make the presentation even more off the record. But it's kind of what I mean. But let me start what I mean technically. What I mean technically is if we think of the distribution of any indicator of well-being across people, there's a distribution of that indicator of well-being. If we think of just happiness, some people are happy, some people are less. If we think of income, there's a distribution of income. If we think of educational attainment, there's a distribution of educational attainment. If we think of the distribution of anything, there's a distribution. Now, there's two ways we can think about making the bottom part of that distribution better off. One is we can just shift the whole distribution upward. Just kind of everyone gets better off, including at kind of the same proportional rate, those at the low end and those at the high end, and kind of everybody gets better off. The other way is if you think about the distribution, the other thing we can do is we can draw some line through that distribution, declare that at that line something special happens, and then focus on getting the people below that line just up to that line. So we essentially induce a kink in the distribution, and we're really focused on bringing the bottom of that distribution up to a line, right? So, $1.25 day of poverty is just a line through the distribution of income. We take all people, we array them by their per capita consumption, and then say, $1.25, there's a line. But there is no line. There's no line, right? What would a line look like? Well, there is a line in the world sometimes. There's a line at 0 degrees Celsius. Because on one side of 0 degrees Celsius, water is hard. And it has a certain way of behaving. It's ice. On the other side of 0 degrees Celsius, water is very different. It's fluid. And so there's a line in the space of temperature with respect to which there's a process, complete change of state of water from ice to water. And we might be really concerned about that dramatic change across the state. Okay? There is no line. People on one side of $1.25 a day look exactly like people on the other side of $1.25 a day. In every conceivable dimension. Take health. If I draw a line of health status and show you health status arrayed by income on the axis, there's no line. Yes, people as they get richer tend to have better health status at exactly the same pace over almost the entire range of the distribution. If I show you malnutrition of children, as people get better off, their children are less likely to be malnourished. At exactly the same pace over almost the entire range of the distribution. If I show you happiness, people get happier as they get richer. At exactly the same pace over almost the entire array of the distribution. Nobody in the history of man has celebrated crossing the poverty line. There has never been, I'm at $1.26 a day party. Right? So, now, why do, so, and I was, so, this is, the poverty line, therefore, is a complete socially constructed myth. It's just, we made it up. I was there when we made it up. There was a report on poverty in the World Bank in 1991, and for that report, they needed a headline number of how many poor people there are in the world. To have a headline number of how many people are in the world, you need a line. And there was a big debate about where that line should be. And one of the methods for drawing that line was to say, let's look at the poverty lines of the poorest countries in the world and say, let's just adopt as the global poverty line the worst poverty line. Not the poverty line of the United States, not the poverty line of Germany, not the poverty line of Brazil. Let's adopt the poverty line of Sudan as the poverty line for the whole planet. Now, as a low bound, that makes some sense. But I went to the director of the report at the time and said, as the line that defines what poverty is, or now at least we say extreme poverty is, this is a crazy line. It's way too low. We're defining ourselves out of the development business of improving the prosperity of everyone by allowing ourselves to be backed into a definition of poverty that's completely arbitrary. Let's say $10 a day is poverty, because that's what, after all, that's what the US says it is. It actually says it's much higher than that. Why wouldn't we adopt as a global standard what the rich countries say? After all, if a rich country says its citizen is poor when their income is below this line, what exactly doesn't endow a Brazilian or a Serbian or a Nigerian to aspire to exactly the same standard that an American or German or UK citizen has? He told me that was ridiculous, not surprisingly. And then I said, but this line is just crazy. It will lead us into all kinds of negative, weird, twisted logics by focusing on kinking around a line that doesn't exist. And you know what he said to me? He said, don't worry. This line is so crazy, it will never become popular. We'll use it for this report. It will create a headline number, and it will disappear in 2 weeks. Now, unfortunately, I was right and he was wrong. And so, now, how is this? So I want to just emphasize 2 more points, right? Why is this a positive danger? It's a positive danger because if we focus on the kink, we get the international politics wrong and we get the domestic politics wrong. So let's shift to a different domain. For the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal that's kind of in force till the end of 2015, they wanted, everyone wants to have an education goal. So what did you adopt as an education goal? Every child should complete primary school. So we took the distribution of just completion of people around the world and drew a line at a very low base. Some countries define primary school as 5, some define it as 7, but it's very few years of school, and said, let's draw a kink at that line and encourage everybody to get above the kink. So first of all, 2 problems with that. At exactly completing primary schooling, nothing happens. There's nothing special about completing grade 6. It's not like you complete grade 6 and you're ready for life, right? Second, it took off the agenda all the rest of the educational things, like what do we do about vocational training, what do we do about universities, what do we do about secondary schooling, because in principle there was then a tension between the domestic agenda and the international agenda, and the international agenda had to, in some sense, stick to its goal of, well, the MDG is just about this, and beyond that, well, it's not about the MDG. Okay. So, second, it limited attention to actually what the student had learned, right? It measured schooling like you would measure prison. Time served, right? If you sat in a building for 6 years, you had completed primary schooling. Nothing in the agenda could legitimately ground itself in the international agenda, even about learning quality, without it being explicitly articulated. So, I am, as you might have noticed, against the narrow agenda. I don't want the narrow agenda even on the agenda. I want to have exclusively broad goals. Exclusively development as the shift of everybody getting better off. And if we get everybody better off, we'll meet all those low goals anyway. If we set ambitious targets for what we want human well-being to be, right, we're going to meet those targets. So, lastly, how are we getting the international politics wrong? We're getting the international politics wrong because many of you are from countries that really have nothing at stake in the low goals. If you're from Brazil, for instance, none of the low goals in the current MDGs can possibly provide a driving agenda for what a development agenda in Brazil should mean. Can't be primary schooling per se. You know, Brazil was there, except for maybe some of the Northeast states, but Brazil was there a long time ago, right? It's got to be a quality agenda. It's got to be a higher research agenda. It's got to be a quality of universities agenda. You know, the MDGs pick off just certain diseases. We're going to attack malaria. Not a big issue in Brazil. We're going to attack, a few of the diseases in the world. A disease agenda is not a health systems agenda. Brazil has to have a health systems agenda, right? You slice off dollar-a-day poverty. It's inconsequential in Brazil, even though Brazil has huge inequality challenges. So let me conclude by saying, even 10 years ago, I was still working for the World Bank, and I met with one of my favorite policymakers from India, and we had been close friends for some time, and he said to me, "You guys at the World Bank are just not helpful." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, you keep coming and you saying, the poor, the poor, the poor, the poor." And hey, I'm all for that, right? I'm as much for the poor as you want. But if you guys only want to talk about what impacts the poor, in India today, that's 24% of the population. I don't know if you've noticed, because you're kind of an economist, a technocrat, work for a big organization, but India is a democracy. And I don't know if you've really focused on how democracies work, but I need 51% of the votes. Right? I can't run on a poverty agenda where poverty is defined so low that it excludes, it excludes 75% of the voters. I can't go with an electoral campaign that says my exclusive and primary concern is with kinky stuff. Right? I have to look at the bread and butter stuff. Second, I don't know if you've noticed, but once I get 51% of the vote, I'm actually the government of India. And as the government of India, I care about all Indians. And I have to represent and somehow amalgamate the interests of all Indians. And if that Indian happens to be in the 75th percentile, happens to be in the 80th percentile, I still have to represent the interests of all Indians. So I want policies and I want help from the development agenda that helps me help all Indians. A, because I need at least 51% of them to even be in charge. And B, because once I'm in charge, I have a responsibility to my citizens, all of my citizens, to pursue the policies that make them better off. So I feel we need an international agenda that can provide the sound and solid basis for policymaking in the interests of all citizens of all countries in the world, and the narrow focus is going to drive us away from that in a dangerously seductive way that makes it look attractive to focus on the kinky at the expense of the creative, or procreative, we might say. Anyway, thank you very much.